Hello and welcome to another episode of the Talking of Minds podcast. Uh, we have seen that elderly or the senior citizens and even very highly educated people commonly fall for misinformation on the internet, false images on WhatsApp, and they also fall for many financial scams. And nowadays, our elderly also believe a lot of AI slope that is being produced by image generation programs and all. And studies show that elderly are the prime targets of online financial frauds, and the rate of that is also increasing. And specific studies from India had shown that around 13% of WhatsApp group images that were shared during certain election times were fake. And elderly were the number one demographic when it comes to who forwards these fake content, sometimes unknowingly or unintentionally also. And almost everyone is worried about the elderly people believing everything that they see on YouTube or WhatsApp. Any content, anything that looks like news, they consume and believe as news. And this is also worrying because around the world, uh, even today, it is the elderly people or people who are above 50s and 60s who wield a lot of political power, who wield a lot of power on decision making that affects everyone. And then this entire generation seems to be falling for any kind of misinformation that is or bullshit that is being spread on the internet. So this episode, we are trying to look at the existing evidence about what makes people in general and the seniors in particular susceptible to misinformation and scams on the internet, or misinformation in general. So the reasons are, they belong to two, three categories. One is obviously the biological and psychological reasons. So once people start aging, emotional and affective processing becomes dominant rather than rational processing of information, which means that elders are more likely to rely on emotional appeals and heuristics, rather than analytical reasoning when they evaluate information. And emotionally charged misinformation becomes even more persuasive when it comes to the elderly. And elderly people, as people age, there's a lot of deficits in the source monitoring capacities. So the ability to accurately identify the sources of information gets reduced once people age. And people, as they age, people rely more on familiarity than accuracy of sources. So when something is familiar to you, something looks like a news article, something looks like a news presentation, they are more likely to believe it, that even if it comes from an unknown source, or or a source that is proven to be untrustworthy. And also, as we age, there is something called positivity bias, which kicks in more, which is the tendency to interpret ambiguous information as being positive. So anything that is presented to us, it is more likely that we just believe it as we age. And there is also documented issue of a weaker connectivity that happens within the prefrontal cortex with aging, so which impairs the ability to for evaluating the trustworthiness of information. And this is particularly found in the in terms of people getting caught in financial scams. And because of this problem with the connectivity within the prefrontal cortex, it is seen that seniors are more likely to overestimate the trustworthiness of others, and they are less likely to adjust this trustworthiness, even they feel betrayed, or even when they are betrayed by people that they trust. They don't lower the trustworthiness score of these people. So once you trust someone, even if you have evidence that this person cannot be trusted, it is very difficult for a senior person to label them as untrustworthy. So these are all biological and psychological reasons behind what we think to be the higher susceptibility of the elderly to fall for misinformation and scams. And then there are cultural reasons, or society, so social reasons. We know that when compared to people who have were born in the 70s, 80s, or 90s, the people who were born before that, 50s, 60s, or in those decades, they have as a generation, they have a digital literacy gap with the younger people. And it is really difficult for them to know when an image is manipulated, or when a sponsored content is shown as genuine news, or genuine content. They really have a specific gap in the literacy in that area, which is which this gap can be filled with uh, you know uh, proper training and digital literacy campaigns. And it is also seen that this digital literacy gap actually exists regardless of education attainment. So even highly educated people can have this problem with this, which is related to the gap in understanding, or differentiating the trustworthiness of sources on the internet. And some research that has been done in the Western context have also shown that people who belong to more on the conservative side of the political spectrum are more susceptible to misinformation, irrespective of their education or income. And studies on conspirituality have also pointed into that, this direction. And then there is a major factor of how media was during the 50s to 60s, 70s, and 80s. Because if you look at the 60s, 70s, there were only a very few sources of trustworthy information. So you had either printed newspapers, printed books, television news, and one or two radio channels that you could get at any place on the earth. And all these operated under much more strict editorial oversights and even government regulations on how can what they can cover, how much they can tell people. And all these platforms had at least some form of fact checking, and most of these platforms were liable for any kind of false statement that would appear on their platform, be it a newspaper or a book, or a radio channel. So content was much more regulated and edited in the pre-internet era. Now, a person who grew up in the pre-internet era cannot easily grasp that in 2025 you can have a very small studio setup, and you can actually present something which is very similar to a newspaper present, or sorry, a news presentation. And it can all be utter bullshit, created by someone with no relationship to facts. But if you make this look like a TV news presentation, an elderly person is much more likely to believe that, because they have been brought up in such a such as an environment where something presented in that form was believable. Now that is another major reason why for the elderly it becomes very difficult to distinguish between reliable and non-reliable sources of information. So these were all some of the reasons what that make the elderly people around us, including our own parents or seniors, or even very serious, very senior politicians, susceptible to different kinds of misinformation, scams, and more recently AI generated content. Now the question lies in what can be done for this, what can be done to address this. One thing that can be done is targeted digital literacy campaigns, which have been found useful in addressing this problem in some of the existing research. And as I said, it has to be targeted. It has to take into account who are the audience, and what are the different ways in which the brains of the elderly work, how they process information, and what are the kinds of misinformation that they can encounter. So when digital literacy content is curated to these kind of characters of the receivers, it can be very helpful. And also there is this opportunity of using reverse socialization, using grandchildren or very young children to educate the elderly people. And there have been some experiments done in this regard also. So one problem that has been pointed out by the learners, or by the elderly, is that the children or the grandchildren or the children who are supposed to be educated do not have as much patience, as the elderly, and sometimes that becomes a point of friction. And then we can actually train children, to make them understand why, when you are teaching something to an elderly person, they may ask the same question again and again, just like a small child. They why an elderly person may be very slow to pick up your lessons. And we can actually train the children to be trainers of the elderly in the reverse socialization to make them more digitally literate. And it is also a very viable option to produce educational content and present it in the places where the elderly already exist. We have a lot of places where the elderly people come together, online or offline. There are their own WhatsApp groups, there are retirement homes, there are places, there are organizations of the elderly, the pensioners organization. There are a lot of places the elderly people come together. We can actually integrate digital literacy campaigns into the places that already exist, or the places where already the elderly come together. That's another avenue of addressing this susceptibilities of elderly to misinformation and scams. And as a society, we should also be thinking about the responsibility of the platforms that enable the sharing of misinformation and false informations, or malinformations. The platforms cannot uh, treat content only on the basis of how much engagement they generate. All platforms, just like the earlier platforms of newspapers and news channels, all media platforms should have some kind of responsibility towards the content that is being produced uh, and disseminated through their platforms. So there should be calls for accountability on the side of platforms as well, not just looking at individuals and teaching individuals. We should also be, as a society, we should also be asking questions to the platforms that enable the sharing of this information as well. So these are some of the points that I had to share with regard to the elderly and misinformation and scams. And that's it. Thanks for listening.